The word historic has been used again and again in the last week, but has it maybe been overused? To answer that question, we turn to historian and prolific author Dr. Tessa Dunlop for an authoritative view. Tessa, have we been overusing the word historic?
At times, I think so. It's been bandied about ad infinitum, and I think in the context in which it's been used over the last 10 days, there's been this idea that therefore it's a good thing, that somehow this is about repeating and celebrating the high noon of our history, the sort of pinnacle of great Britishness, particularly attached to the House of Windsor, when in fact there's been quite a lot of invented tradition. Last night we saw the vigil of the grandchildren. Well, that was a first. There was a vigil of grandchildren for the Queen Mother, but of course she wasn't monarch. We've never had a vigil of grandchildren, including, of course, the princesses, before.
But excuse me, don't things that happen for the first time constitute historic events?
Well, then that becomes history. I agree. But what we're actually seeing is a process of nation creating. We're recrafting, reaffirming, rebuilding ideas of Britishness as we go. But I don't think, for instance, the Vigil of the Princes, again, that was referred to as historic, and that kept being used across all the broadcasters. Well, there was only really in recent history one Vigil of the Princes, and that was for George V. And I don't think we particularly want to recall that Vigil of the Princes because it was all about being brotherly solidarity, of course, led by Edward VIII. And we know what happened 11 months later.
But you see, I think people have been using historic in a different sense. They don't mean this is something which is sanctioned by precedent. They mean this is something that we're all going to remember. It's historic in that sense.
OK, so there's two different trains of thought here, and it's possible that we could broker that there's both at play. But I think definitely the idea that a lot of this is pulled from history and has historical precedent has been at the fore. Well, I'm going to go to a third party here, Michael. What do you think, Paul?
I think that, yes, there's an argument to say that if you use the term this is historical, you may be talking about something that has just happened in the moment for the first time. But personally, when someone says, look, this is history in the making, I would probably infer it in that way as well. But nonetheless, it has been completely peppered, the whole thing, with historical events, by which I mean the definition that these have happened before. Is that sufficiently diplomatic?
Yeah, it is. But it's also interesting, isn't it, that we are using this term historic because this is something that will be remembered and will cast back to. And somehow that we frame history around positive national events. There's quite a lot of other things that are going on under the surface.
No, of course.
That we don't, hold up as historic, but which equally will go down in history, like the cost of living crisis or that we haven't seen before.
Are people buying into, I mean, obviously, people are mourning the Queen, but are they buying into it also because, in your view, because they have that real sense of history, they know that these are once-in-a-lifetime events, or are people a little bit moved by the whole celebrity nature of the thing? Look, there's William and Harry and they've fallen out. How much is dominated by that, do you think?
Well, this is what's interesting about that grandchildren's vigil last night. What inspired that was apparently, that they were invited by the King, by Charles, to stand around their grandmother's coffin. But I do think that's about reaching younger generations. It's also about this reaffirmation of family monarchy, because that's really been the brand of the House of Windsor until it got horribly knocked off track in the 1990s. It's been the brand of the House of Windsor since its inception in 1917. Avuncular George V, very loyal to his wife, May. They sort of plodded on. He was the archetypal sort of country, like shooting pheasants and, pottering up to Buckingham Palace if he had to.
Shooting peasants or pheasants, did you say?
Pheasants. And ever since then, that brand grew. And, of course, it reached its apogee with Philip and Elizabeth.
But then is there a risk here? Family has been re-emphasised during this period, of course. And yet we know that there are two glaring problems within the close family, the Duke of York and Prince Harry. And we're seeing Prince Harry at the moment. There he was in that vigil that you've been talking about. But we're probably not going to see much more of him in the future, are we?
No, and that's why this is the sort of case of pasting over the cracks. It's a reminder, I think, to everyone, including Harry and William, that they are greater than the sum of their parts when they operate together. Certainly, it's been very powerful, a lot of the imaging, and it seems to have pleased people, it's pleased the press, and one presumes it will have pleased the late monarch Elizabeth. But I go back to that 1936 Vigil of the Princes between, the tensions between David, as he was known, Edward VIII, and George VI, as he would become Bertie. They never really spoke again by the end of that year in 1936, and he was scarcely allowed in the country. Interestingly, on funerals, the exiled, he became Duke of Windsor, of course, the exiled Edward VIII came both to his brother's funeral in 1952, so the accession of Elizabeth, and then a few months later to his mother's funeral, Queen Mary's, but he wasn't invited to the coronation.
And was it the Bahamas he was exiled to as
That
governor?
was during the Second World War. They sort of shunted him off.
He was governor of
Governor
the Bahamas.
General of the Bahamas.
Historians are trained not to talk about turning points in history. However, the change of monarch must lead to changes. We can't necessarily predict what these changes are, but this is another sense in which I would say this is historic. Tomorrow will be different from today. I can't yet tell you how, but it will be. And the fact that we've moved from one monarch to a different monarch will be part of the causality of that. Is that not true in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, there's an uncomfortable rub here, and it's almost one of the unique selling points of monarchy, that as we mourn one monarch, another ascends to the throne. And I think what's been interesting is the way in which voices against the ascension of Charles III have been crushed, downplayed, not reported, and people have felt embarrassed about them because we're in this period of deferential mourning. So there's this inbuilt survival instinct of monarchy where you actually future-proof the next king by saying we can't really criticise anything to do with the House of Windsor in this period of mourning. So he's become a de facto king and by the time we've left the period of mourning.
De jure as well, by the way. De jure as well.
Some people have been saying for years that when the Queen died, it would be the Republican moment because the Queen was held in such respect, and other members, including Charles, while he enjoys respect and admiration, it's certainly not at the same level as the Queen. So people often said, didn't they, look, when this Queen goes, the monarchy is going to have a real problem maintaining its role and maintaining its popularity.
But if you look,
I sense that hasn't quite happened.
Well, but for precisely the reason, in some respects, I think, that he's a man in grief. He's just lost his mother. One's respecting that and also respecting the late Queen. But if you think of when Trump, first became president, that was where you got a huge amount of protest. For example, generally, when you get a new leader, for whatever reason, especially in the case of an unelected leader, which is what King Charles is, you might expect an airing and discussion about that ascension to the throne. But it's inbuilt in the monarchical system.
I entirely take your point. And I would like to pay tribute to all those people in the country who are not monarchists and have shown remarkable restraint in this last period.
I think they have.
They really have, and I think that's great. But I also think that what has happened in the last 10 days is no indicator of what will happen in the future, because this has been a very special period. There will be a debate about the role of the monarchy, and I think King Charles III will be a very full participant in that discussion. He may even be an initiator of parts of that discussion. But I think people who are sitting at home seething, thinking, nothing's going to be different, I think it will be different. The monarchy has survived because it has adapted. Paul and I were discussing earlier the moment of crisis 25 years ago over the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Well, it had to adapt and it emerged from that. And if there are problems that emerge in the future, then the monarchy will do its best again to adapt.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think what we've seen, this frenetic visiting of all four nations that Charles has had to undertake, let's face it, not in the first flush of youth, is an indication of the monarchy's awareness of really the fragility of his crown as the titular head of the United Kingdom.
Certainly the delicacy, if not the fragility, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And his mother didn't have to endure. I almost think it was a bit of an endurance course that he was set on, because there was no devolved parliament in Wales, there was no devolved parliament in Scotland. It was a very different political scene over which she reigned.
Are we still going to have a monarchy in 50 years' time?
I think
we'll call you back to justify your answer one way or the other.
I think it would be very hard to unpick monarchy from the British Constitution. I mean, that would be a pretty intense job. We may see, and I think Charles would welcome this, less of a celebrity monarchy. I think less of a huge headline news monarchy. People use a slightly derogative term of the bicycling monarchies for the North European models, but in a way, they seem to manage to fulfil the titular role without having this assault on their private lives, which we see in a choreographed way at the moment, but which often has no real boundaries.
We were talking about the Spanish monarchy earlier, and I looked it up online. Officially, the Spanish royal family is 6 people. So it's very slimmed down. And that's exceptionally large because there's a king emeritus, a king who abdicated and retired.
He's
and,
Juan
his wife, Juan Carlos, and his queen are members of the royal family. So there's the king and queen, and the king's parents are still in the royal family. So it's very slimmed down. I remember being at a lunch once, and I found myself sitting next to a woman who introduced herself as King Juan Carlos's sister. And I said, my goodness, I had no idea you were going to be here. There was no protocol whatsoever.
You thought, how do I bow?
And I said, well, I didn't have to bow because that's the whole point. She was not covered by the protocol.
Right.
And I said to her, when did you know you were coming to attend this lunch? She said, oh, my brother called me this morning and asked me whether I could come along. Right. Can you imagine any member of the British royal family
but isn't the converse
taking an appointment at 6 hours' notice?
Isn't the converse of that is if one of those, the monarch in one of those Northern European countries died, would it attract the funeral? Would it attract pretty much every foreign leader of every foreign state?
You know the answer to that.
Well, exactly, and that's the other argument, isn't it?
Forward wind 15 years. I mean, I don't want to dear Charles, but he won't live forever. What kind of funeral will we have then? It is partly because we were from one of the big imperial houses. If you think that the German emperor crashed out at the end of the First World War, ditto Austro-Habsburgs, likewise
Russia,
the Tsars in Russia.
Yeah.
So we're left as the one big gun. Historically, and the monarchies, I mean, to an extent, Spain a little bit, but then, of course, Franco gets in the way. But the North European monarchies and so forth had never been such enormous players in more recent history. But coupled with that, you, of course, have the longevity of Elizabeth's reign. I'm convinced one of the deep appeals of the late Queen is that she ties us back to the Blitz. She ties us back to what history now calls the Great Generation.
Yeah, I think
the Winston Churchill era.
Yes. Will there be a monarchy in 50 years' time? I think there will be,
so.
but not necessarily, because any institution can be destroyed by the people who make up that institution. If there's prolonged bad behaviour, whether we're talking about a public corporation, a business, or an institution like the monarchy, it can be destroyed by the people within it. Let's hope that doesn't happen.
And that's what I've slightly felt was lacking over the last 10 days. I understand we're in a period of mourning and we need to be respectful, but I felt sometimes the extent of the coverage where people are just talking on national channels ad infinitum, often historically inaccurate, not well informed, when actually there are
present company accepted.
Naturally, I was corrected. Did you notice by Michael very earlier? But we're doing our best. But when along the ticker tape of live news, pound crashed to 37-year low, trade deficit highest level in modern history, and I'm hearing a historian say this is the first lying of state since. This lying in state goes back to George V, and I think that's not even accurate. So we're hearing inaccuracies when I feel let's put it into 15 or 10 minutes and then move on to actually other big issues. And that doesn't then give the 50% of the nation who are lukewarm or apathetic towards monarchy a reason to feel angry about monarchy.
Well, I think it's been marvellous to have a discussion about the word history. Tessa Dunlop, thank you very much for joining us on GB News.